Frizz. I'm the director of CBRL, and on behalf of all of us at CBRL, I'm delighted to welcome you all to our beautiful UK home here at the British Academy, whether you're joining us in the room or joining us online. At CBRL, we're committed to conducting and supporting excellent academic research across the Levant, which is why we're incredibly happy to welcome our distinguished speaker, chair and panelists this evening. Our event this evening is chaired by Professor Dawn Chatty, who is CBRL's president. Dawn is Emeritus Professor and former Director of the Refugee Study Centre at the University of Oxford. And she's a leading expert on forced migration in the Middle East, nomadic pastoral tribes and refugee communities. And Dawn will be introducing Daniel and our panellists shortly. Before I hand over, though, a few housekeeping notes, as always. For those of you in the room, if there's a fire alarm, please make your way out using that door. And for those online, hopefully we'll have some time for questions. So please put your questions in the Q&A box and we'll do our best to get to some of those at the end. And finally, online, if you have any problems with the audio or visual, please put a note in the Q&A box and we will try to get to that, we'll try to fix that as quickly as possible. So on that note, I will hand over to our chair for the evening, Professor Dawn Chatty.
Jane, thank you very much. It's really my pleasure to be here tonight for an event, a launch of a wonderful book on Syria. I'm sure there'll be many others coming out, but this one is particularly special. I just want to say a little bit about Daniel. He is currently a non-resident fellow at the Crown Center for Middle Eastern Studies at Brandeis University in Massachusetts. Or I could say Boston almost. It's kind of the outskirts of Boston. He's a political scientist, and he's worked for, I would say, a good decade, if not more, on conflict and state building in the Middle East, with a focus on Syria. Neep is the author of a book which I think emerged from his doctoral dissertation, but he can correct me if I'm wrong, called Occupying Syria, Insurgency, Space, and State Formation, which was published in 2012. He holds a PhD from the School of Oriental and African Studies here in London. And his research has been widely supported by the Andrew Mellon Foundation, the Woodrow Wilson Center for International Scholars, the American Druze Foundation, the British Academy, and the Council for British Research in the Levant, as well as the Arts and Humanities Research Council here in the UK. He's taught at a number of universities, including Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service, University of Exeter, Department of Political Science at George Washington University. I first met Daniel, I think it was in 2010, when we were looking for a director to open up a branch of CBRL in Damascus, Syria. And Daniel stole the event. He was appointed as director, and he served from January 2011 in Damascus until, I'm not sure, April 2012, something like that. And then things got hot, and he transferred to Amman for the second year. This evening, we'll have the opportunity to hear him talk about his second book, A History of Modern Syria, which presents his analysis of Syria's political developments in terms of global transformation, changing economic infrastructure, emerging political geographies, and waves of political protest. What's wonderful about this book is it reaches back from his first book, which was really about the savagery. I'm sorry, I hope that nobody here is French. I'm going to say the savagery of the French occupation or the French mandate, colonial mandate, between the two world wars and to the present time. So I think it's particularly interesting that here we are now with Syria again at a time of transition. The book shows how these kind of transitions have been going on cyclically, really, at least for the last 150 years or so. But what's really special about tonight as well is we have a panel of young Syrian scholars who will comment about parts of his book. We have Hayyan Dukan, who is a lecturer or professor at the University of Teesside. His PhD was granted in 2019, and it's on the state and tribes in Syria, informal alliances and conflict patterns. So I think we're going to hear something about Bedouin in Syria. We have Ammar Azzouz, who is an architect by training and a British Academy Research Fellow at the School of Geography at Oxford at present. And his most recent work, published in 2023, is Domicide, Architecture, War, and the Destruction of Home in Syria. And we also have Hiba Salim with us. She is currently a research associate in forced migration studies at the Refugee Studies Centre in Oxford. She received her degree in education at the University of Cambridge, and she is now the recipient of the Oxford University First Book Prize for her manuscript, which emerges from her thesis, The Politics of Education and Hope in Forced Migration, Journeys of Syrian Young Peoples Across the World. So after Daniel has given us his introduction, half an hour about, we'll have an opportunity then for the panelists to comment, interrogate, ask more questions before we open it up to the floor. So this should be really an exciting event. Daniel.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dawn, for that kind introduction. I would first like to thank the Council for British Research and the Levant for hosting the event, and Dawn Chatty for chairing. And I'm very grateful as well to the panel of scholars who have agreed to comment on the themes of the book. It is a great privilege to be able to have the opportunity to discuss the history of Syria with you all today and in this venue. And would also like to thank everyone for coming on a Friday night and for people joining us by Zoom as well. This book has had a long gestation. It began in Damascus in 2011, where I was working, as Dawn mentioned, for the CBRL and living during the early months of the uprising, at a moment when political outcomes felt radically uncertain, and the ways we were accustomed to explaining Syria no longer seemed to work in quite the same way. December 2024 marked another such moment. The collapse of the Assad regime once again unsettled assumptions that had gradually come to feel fixed. And I think the distance between these two moments has very much shaped how this book has been written and the kind of history it tries to tell. In December 2024, the regime of the Assads, which had brutally dominated Syria for over 50 years, suddenly collapsed during a lightning advance by rebel forces. This turn of events was, of course, unexpected. The regime had survived over 13 years of vicious and chaotic conflict at a terrible cost of over 500,000 dead, some 14 million refugees and displaced people, and the devastation of entire neighborhoods, towns, and villages. That a system which had appeared so durable could unravel so quickly came as a shock to many who had come to treat the survival of the Assad regime as a fact of political life in Syria. So today, Syrians face the monumental task of rebuilding their country, not only physically and economically, but also politically. For the first time in over half a century, fundamental questions that had long been closed off are once again open to debate. What kind of constitution should Syria adopt after Assad, and who should write it? Should power remain concentrated in the central state, as in the past, or be devolved to the regions? Should the economy be opened to international competition, or tightly controlled by the government on behalf of the population? Now, that such questions can now be asked openly is itself remarkable. Only a few years ago, many outside observers doubted Syria's continued viability as a sovereign state. Yet by 2026, the breaking of Syria appears less likely than its remaking. So for scholars of history and politics, this moment is striking, not so much for its novelty, as for the way it recalls earlier periods in which Syria's political future appeared suddenly open, uncertain, and contested. The prospect of remaking Syria may appear novel, but it's not without historical precedent. In many respects, debates over the future of Syria in the mid-2020s mirror many of the same political preoccupations with which successive generations of Syrians have been grappling for over 200 years. recurring debates about sovereignty, reform, inequality, and political authority, even as the conditions under which those questions were posed changed dramatically. Now, a long-term historical and sociological perspective, such as the one I adopt in the book, reveals how Syria has been shaped by fitful bursts of repression and protest, tyranny and rebellion, as different would-be rulers have sought to impose their political vision on Syria. The difficulty of imposing that vision has been compounded not only by the country's ethnic, religious, and sectarian diversity, but also by the sheer speed of political change and social transformation during that time. From the Ottoman Empire to French colonialism to post-independence and experiments with liberalism, socialism, and military dictatorship, Syrians have struggled to steer the direction of their country while navigating sea changes in the global economy, tempestuous geopolitical rivalries, and frantic competition between domestic political forces scrabbling for control over resources, status, and power. The sedimented legacies of these struggles mean that Syria has been remade many times before, but never entirely under conditions of its own choosing. So what my book represents then is an attempt to recover these longer processes as historical inheritances, not as a background to the present, but as a way of thinking more carefully about how political order in Syria has been built, how it's endured, and why it has so often proved vulnerable to strain. Now, the book is it's an old-fashioned historical narrative. It's not super theoretical. It's not framed in terms of any great theoretical debates. But the challenge in writing the book is essentially the challenge that I faced in giving this talk, how to cover over 2 centuries of history without reducing it to a kind of mere chronology, a succession of regimes and coups and so forth. So what I'm going to do in the talk is to kind of outline the main organizing theme that the book is organized and is built upon, and hopefully that will shed some light on kind of the underlying problematic, the underlying way in which I think about Syrian history. And in the book, I organize the narrative around the problem of uneven development. Now, uneven development sounds like a slightly technical phrase, but the intuition behind it is fairly ordinary. It refers to the way in which economic change, state investment, infrastructure, and even coercive power don't spread evenly across space or society. Some regions are pulled into markets early. Others are treated as backwaters until suddenly they become valuable. Some groups in those regions acquire property, education, political access. Others are included mainly as labor, taxpayers, or conscripts. So the result of this process is not simply inequality in the abstract, but a very specific geography of inequality. A country which is experienced very differently, depending on whether one lives in a commercial quarter of Damascus, a grain village in the Hauran, a drought-prone area of the Jazeera, or the edge of Aleppo's industrial belt. And this perspective also shapes how familiar explanations of Syria's modern history are treated in the book. I don't treat them as claims to be refuted one by one, but as products of a short historical vision. Now, each of the typical ways in which Syria has been talked about in the past contains an element of truth. Yet each of them distorts the historical record in ways that often obscure more than they illuminate. So I'm going to briefly outline 3 examples, because they're so common in how not only scholars, but also, in particular, the media speak about Syria. And the first comes in the persistent invocation of the Sykes-Picot Agreement as the foundational explanation for Syria's instability. The argument here is that Syria's borders were imposed arbitrarily by colonial powers, grouping together disparate communities and producing a state that was never viable. This is my obligatory map of the post-Sykes-Picot settlement. And this narrative, this Sykes-Picot narrative, has proven remarkably durable, I think in part because it offers a clear origin story for Syria's disorder. And yet, as I explain in the book, the idea of Syria as a political space, as a cultural space, predates the First World War. The processes of administrative integration, infrastructural development, and even regional consciousness were already well underway in the 19th century. Now, the importance of these external borders is not just that they arbitrarily bisect group identities, but that they reorganize administrative centrality and access. which cities become hubs, which regions become marginalized, who gets infrastructure, who gets contracts, and who meets the capital chiefly through coercion and violence. Sectarianism offers a second example. In a lot of contemporary commentary, sectarian difference in Syria is presented as a kind of latent force that, once released, overwhelms all other forms of political identification. And the civil war is then read as the inevitable outcome of long-suppressed communal divisions. And this view, again, depends on a short historical frame that treats sectarian identities as fixed and primordial. A longer perspective reveals something quite different. Sectarianism in Syria has taken multiple forms over time. It's been episodic communal violence. It's been a strategy of political mobilization. It's been the byproduct of institutional bias and uneven development. At various points in Syria's modern history, sectarian affiliation mattered less than region, class, or ideology. And to read the war of the 2010s, primarily through a sectarian lens, is to project the outcome backward, allowing the end of the story to determine its beginning. And finally, these short time horizons also distort how economic reform is understood. The liberalization measures introduced in the late 20th and early 21st centuries are often portrayed either as cynical window dressing by the regime or as the decisive rupture that destroyed a previously stable authoritarian contract. Both these interpretations simplify a much longer story. When reform is framed narrowly as neoliberal betrayal, its cumulative effects and its interaction with older institutional arrangements are missed. So taken together, narratives like this show the cost of short time horizons. You know, they offer clarity, but at the expense of depth. They offer a certain coherence, but at the expense of process. They encourage us to explain Syria by locating a single moment of failure, colonial partition, sectarian eruption, economic liberalization, rather than by tracing how political order was repeatedly assembled, strained, and reassembled over time. And the product of that, the result, is not just that it's a mistake, it's not just an analytical error, but it creates a certain narrowing of the imagination in which Syria's past is just a sequence of mistakes, a sequence of errors, and its future is just a problem of repair and reconstruction, rather than another phase of historical remaking. So this is why uneven development is, for me, the main framing device of the book, and because it allows me to explain political rupture without reaching quickly for cultural fatalism. You know, the familiar mosaic society story, or the reflex to attribute Syria's modern history primarily to this externally imposed border. And it also perhaps offers a way of writing modern Syrian history that keeps the catastrophe in view without allowing it to determine all explanation. As I note in the preface, the liberalization of the 2000s dramatically reshaped the country's urban geography and exacerbated long-standing inequalities between Syria's diverse regions. The protests of 2011, when they first started, were initially more about changing this deeply uneven system than they were about overthrowing the regime. So the story here is about how stratified social and regional developments repeatedly generates political conflict. The emphasis throughout the book is on inheritance, not on inevitability. To see why this matters, it helps to start where the book starts, the 19th century countryside. This is where my face lights up. Before modern property rights and cadastral registration, much rural land in Ottoman Syria was cultivated through a system known as reshape, a communal system in which strips of farmland were periodically redistributed among families. The logic wasn't egalitarianism in any abstract sense, but risk management. In an environment where rainfall is unreliable and harvest failure is common, this spread exposure across different households. When Ottoman reformers introduced compulsory land registration through the 1858 Land Code, they hoped to rationalize taxation and incentivize investment by assigning land just one individual owner, the way in which it's more familiar to us now. But this reform produced the opposite effect. It accelerated the concentration of land in the hands of big notable families. It created absentee landlords in cities who extracted profit from peasants who'd been turned into tenant sharecroppers. This is Syria's equivalent to the enclosure of the commons. The book doesn't treat this process as an incidental agrarian question. It's the making of a social hierarchy that later politics both reproduces and contests. And this mechanism matters because it is inherently spatial. Land registration folds unevenly across different regions, and the book explicitly analyzes variation across different zones. Cities of the interior, Mount Lebanon, the Hauran in the south, the coastal mountains, and the eastern lands, including the Jazeera and the desert. In the interior, for example, suspicious peasants, who are people are always suspicious of the government and the government's intentions, often didn't register the land. Notables did, the members of these big families, sometimes claiming they were protecting villages from the state. Don't worry about the paperwork, we'll look after you. Sometimes buying up forfeited land. The results can be described as an effective legal robbery, with peasants left to survive on punishing shares of the harvest, sometimes as little as a quarter, under conditions of erratic rainfall. So uneven development here is not just a consequence of later neoliberalism, it's baked into the legal and fiscal infrastructure of the modern state right from the beginning. And once you have that in view, you can interpret 20th century politics in Syria as repeated attempts to manage, exploit, or redress this unevenness, or plural, these unevennesses, usually with mixed motives, almost always with unintended consequences. Take the post-independence liberal period. In the late 1940s, when the Syrian upper middle class elite inherited government after the departure of the French, Syrian liberals effectively asserted that the primacy of urban power centers over the rural periphery that was poor and was often treated as politically suspect. Their economic policy favored nascent light industry, frequently owned by the politicians themselves, and questions of social reform were nowhere on the agenda. So there you have uneven development as a political project. Protect the city's commercial and industrial strata, treat the countryside as a reservoir of extraction, and then act surprised when peripheral unrest becomes chronic. In the late 1940s, as the book explains, Damascus-Damascene liberals addressed this unrest by manipulating internal Druze rivalries and using coercion to repress Alawi rebellions, methods that later observers might mislabel as sectarian management, which are, in this telling, techniques for controlling a marginalized periphery. Then comes the Ba'ath Party, which presents itself as a corrective. Land reforms and nationalizations after 1963 break the back of the old bourgeoisie, the old landowning elite. But the book is not a simple celebration of state-led equalization. Some of the other scholarship does that a little bit. The book instead tracks the oscillation. Hafiz al-Assad's more moderate economic stance, he's always described as more moderate than the moment before. I feel the need to use scare quotes. Hafiz al-Assad's more moderate economic stance in the 1970s grants the old elite something of a reprieve while consolidating state power, but also nurturing a new class enriched through controlled private sector opportunities. The point here is not that Syria moved from inequality to equality and back again. The point is that the forms of inequality changed during this time, from land and notable domination to statist redistribution with new hierarchies to crony capitalism entangled with liberalization. And this is where I think this idea of uneven development becomes a powerful way to narrate the Bashar al-Assad years without turning them into an ideological caricature. The preface of the book, frame Bashar's era as Syria's attempts to articulate a local version of global economic liberalism. The social market economy, in principle, promised prosperity without sacrificing gains for peasants and workers. In practice, it produced collusion between the next generation of the regime and the super rich. It also produced a speculative boom in construction and services that dramatically reshaped the country's urban geography. And if there's one phrase that captures this idea of uneven development as a kind of lived experience, uneven geography is doing a lot of work there. The beginnings of gated developments, beginnings of gentrified quarters, service economy for the connected, and informal housing and slums on the peripheries for everyone else. And we see the book tracks how those unevennesses becomes politically combustible. The drought of 2006 and 2010 pushed at least 300,000 people, whole families, out of the east into tented settlements on the margins of the cities of Damascus, Aleppo and Daraa. So that climate shock is of course real, but the book emphasizes that state policy amplified it. Deregulated irrigation, encouraged a boom in wells, relentless groundwater depletion, drying tributaries and making water scarcer, more expensive, rental deregulation, allowed landlords to expel rural tenants, producing evictions as land was sold to capitalize on rising real estate values. Again, this is the spatial signature of liberalization. So this is uneven development becoming a political trigger. People who are displaced by drought and policy, peripheral cities absorbing them, work opportunities shrinking, prices rising, the state present mainly as police and bureaucracy. When the preface, I say in the preface that the protests were first about changing a deeply uneven system, I'm not saying that as a kind of rhetorical flourish. It's a claim about causation. It's a claim about what was going on beneath the surface. So this idea of uneven development, it's not a detachable theme in the book. It's the book's method. It's how I make Syrian history legible across 2¼ centuries, 225 years. It connects Ottoman land law to post-war coups. It connects rural peripheries to urban centers. It connects socialist redistribution to neoliberal cronyism, drought ecology to political revolts. And it also, I think, disciplines the analysis, because instead of treating every conflict that happens in the course of 200 years as a clash of essences, it asks harder questions about who's gaining, who's losing out, which regions are privileged, which were sacrificed, and how the state enforces the choices that are made over time. If one theme has dominated the national experience of state building in Syria, it is that of the production, reproduction, and mitigation of social inequality. And by phrasing it in that way, it turns this idea of state building into a social relationship, not just an institutional story. And it also does something to explain why solutions that put identity politics before economic equality elicit a certain suspicion, I think, often amongst Syrians. After all, in Syrian history, identity talk has regularly been the language used to rationalize inequalities, been used to give the pretext for disguise an unequal order, or to manage the anger that inequality produces, rather than to describe the underlying distributional problem. So a useful way to unlearn our habits of sectarian thinking, I think, is to begin with a relationship that looks at first glance like it ought to be sectarian. I'm going to give you one example of that to kind of flesh out this analysis. And I'm going to focus on this area of, you see just here the map kind of shaded a little toward on the border with Jordan. For those of you who are less familiar with Syria, this is an area which is inhabited primarily by members of a religious community known as the Druze, whose practices and beliefs diverge significantly from the mainstream of Islam. This area is known, and this shows it a little better. Okay, you can see the kind of black area on the black area on the bottom right of the slide, which shows the Druze mountain. The terrain is significantly different from surrounding it. This area was known as, calling it the Druze Mountain out of convenience. It was known as Jabal Hawran in the early 19th century. It became known as Jabal ad-Druz in the 1860s, after Druze fleeing conflict in Mount Lebanon came to settle there. It was renamed in the 1950s Jabal al-Arab for nationalist reasons, and it also corresponds to the contemporary governorate of Sweden. So set this area, part of the country against Damascus, the capital of the Sunni establishment and political life. And if you approach that pair with the usual premises, you quickly arrive at a story about minorities and centers, about a heterodox community living in defensive isolation, periodically clashing with the Sunni state. The problem, of course, is that the historical record points you somewhere else. The example of the Druze Mountain and Damascus is important in its own right, but it also does conceptual work here by illustrating how uneven development works. So let's begin with the 19th century. Everything begins with the 19th century. Even then, the Jabal was not an isolated enclave. It was already being drawn into regional and global circuits through connections of grain. The Maidan quarter of Damascus became a crucial hinge between southern Syrian agriculture and international markets. Midani grain merchants procured high-quality wheat grown in the south for export, and in doing so, they developed durable commercial ties with Druze sheikhs who controlled agricultural production in the Haram. And those ties were not fleeting. The merchants would keep second homes in Druze villages. They would host Druze notables in Damascus. They would even lodge the sons of those sheikhs when they came to study in Ottoman schools. So this is quite the opposite of a picture in which different religious communities merely coexist at arm's length. You know, this is not a mosaic where every element is separate. This is elite interpenetration. Penetration networks which are commercial, they're social, they're generational, they're inter-religious and trans-regional. Now, if you are determined to read politics as being about identity, you can always force this into a sectarian frame. But I think that's a worse explanation than the obvious one. The obvious one is this is a relationship of mutual benefit generated by export agriculture and the social infrastructure that comes along with it. Now, consider autonomy. The Jabal's internal social structure was fairly coherent and strongly self-governing. There was a layered hierarchy of sheikhly families and commoners, plus a parallel structure of spiritual sheikhs, all embedded in village life. And this coherence helped the villagers pull together repeatedly throughout the 19th century to defend their collective autonomy against incursions by governmental authorities. So autonomy here is not a theological reflex, it's a political stance, which is made possible by geography, this mountain terrain area, which is in black in the slide, social organization of these tight-knit villages, and the material ability to resist state extraction. Internal tensions within the Jabal reinforce this point, and the book traces how demographic changes in the 19th century intensified inequality within Druze society, producing sharecropping, producing resentment, and prompting lesser families and peasants to start to challenge the status quo. That asymmetry sharpened the internal divisions in the Jabal itself. In the late 1880s, there was a revolt known as the Amir Revolt, which is sometimes forgotten and sometimes misremembered as communal unrest, but it was actually an uprising of commoners against sheikhly domination. Its targets were land control, labor extraction, and social hierarchy. In other words, the revolt was generated by uneven development inside this region. Itself a product of commercialization and demographic pressure. It wasn't a clash with Damascus as a Sunni center. Identity talk did not organize this revolt, political economy did. So this is not obviously sectarian politics. This is class and power within a community shaped by grain demand, taxation, and the changing balance between notables and peasants. And if you miss that part of the story, you end up imputing to the Druze, in inverted commas, a collective political will that did not exist. Under colonial rule, this unevenness was intensified. Under the French mandate, the fragmentation of Syria into statelets and special regimes reoriented the country again unevenly across these regions. The Great Syrian Revolt of 1925 to 1927 began in the Jabal because the effects of administrative intrusion were acutely felt there. But it spread because similar grievances existed elsewhere, grievances about taxation, forced compliance, exclusion from sovereignty. It was the same networks that had been forged through Ottoman schooling, the grain trade, and administration that in the 1920s connected Druze leaders to Damascene nationalists, which allowed the revolt to travel. The French insistence on reading the uprising as sectarian served an inherently political purpose. It allowed them to justify repression. It allowed them to justify divide and rule in a landscape of uneven development that colonial policy had helped to deepen. The same logic shows up again later in the Shishakli dictatorship in the 1950s. During that time, the regime's attempts at enforced standardization and brutal repression of the Jabal didn't yet, even then, activate sect as the operative category. Shishakli's repression didn't provoke an explicitly sectarian reaction because the category of sect had not yet acquired political salience. Sectarian identity became politicized only after that, as a byproduct of the ever more restrictive space available for political activism in the late 50s and 1960s. So I hope that what all of this shows is that what often looks like identity politics is often the after image of struggles over state reach, land, trade, and coercion. So identity sits in this story, but it doesn't drive it. the way that the sectarian template assumes. In fact, the historical sequence is often the reverse of what outside observers imagine. Communal identity becomes politically useful under particular conditions. Conditions of conspiracy, clandestine trust building, zero-sum power struggles, anarchy and extreme violence. It doesn't operate as the timeless foundation of politics. And once you see that, I think a lot of contemporary sectarian explanation starts to look like a habit of mind, not really an analysis. The Druze-Damascus relationship that I was talking about is not a morality tale about ancient enmity or fragile coexistence. It is a case study in how economics can stitch regions together, how state demands can harden local autonomy, and how identity often arrives late. It often arrives as an interpretive gloss that obscures the older, grubbier, and far more instructive realities of politics and material life. What I hope the book does, by offering this longer historical view, what I hope it makes visible is a sense of precedent in Syria. Not in the banal sense that Syria has seen this before, but maybe in the more useful sense that Syrians are not rebuilding now from scratch. There is a long national experience in Syria of state building, of constitutional arguments, of social conflict, and attempts, often clumsy, sometimes brutal, to integrate a diverse society into a single political system. And this experience can furnish two types of resources. One is practical. There are examples of how administrative centralization has been attempted, how it's been resisted, how it's been periodically renegotiated, and how solutions, in inverted commas, imported from outside, have tended to land badly when they collide with the local distributions of wealth, coercion, and opportunity. The other type of resource that this history offers is symbolic, a usable repertoire through which new institutions can be legitimated as homegrown, not as the latest externally sponsored formula. What a history like this cannot offer, what I would never attempt to offer, is a forecast. I think Syria at the moment is in a rare interval of genuine uncertainty. Prior trajectories do not tell you which coalition will eventually harden into a new governing bloc. It doesn't tell you which regimes will accept incorporations or on which terms, or how far external powers will be able to shape the emerging order. A history like this can perhaps sharpen our judgment, but it doesn't eliminate indeterminacy. It can't substitute for politics. A constitution, for example, can encode intentions, but a constitution by itself doesn't build the social forces, it doesn't build the enforcement capacities, it doesn't create the material bargains that make constitutional institutions durable. So in that sense, the temptation to treat, at the moment, constitutional design as the main area of reconstruction reflects a narrowing of historical vision. It's not a solution to Syria's problems. What follows from the discussion, I think, are two pressures that recur across Syria's modern history. First, if reconstruction today reproduces this geography of advantage and neglect, if capital and services are concentrated in an archipelago of investment, while other regions experience the state mainly as extraction, as policing, or as abandonment, then political order in Syria will remain brittle, regardless of constitutional design. Syria's post-war divisions are not only between communities, they're also between urban and rural, between wrecked urban peripheries and protected cores, and crucially, between those living on wages, those living on accumulated wealth, and those living on, frankly, nothing. Moments of political settlement that have bracketed those inequalities in the past have tended to displace conflict, not resolve it. And second, I think Syria's history teaches us to be wary. It teaches us to be wary of settlements that are framed as identity engineering, quotas, fixed communal shares, externally imagined cantons presented as safeguards against tyranny. Syria's own modern history suggests that sectarian categories become politically salient under very specific conditions, often when other forms of political bargaining are closed off, and when inequality and coercion are managed through these communal intermediaries. A settlement that starts by freezing identities into institutions risks entrenching the fault lines of future conflicts. From a historical vantage point, Perhaps a more durable starting point might be distributional, resources, rights, and coercion. Who gets what, under what protections, and who controls the instruments of force? And I think that is perhaps why the most hopeful fact about this current juncture in Syria is perhaps the hardest. Uneven development, as I mentioned, is not only produced internally, but also through Syria's international position. Now, after years of failed diplomacy and abandonment by the world, it may well be that Syrians would be better off if they could make decisions about politics largely on their own. But Syria does not get the luxury of an internal reform struggle conducted without external interference. Even if international actors do not design Syria's constitution, they can still constrain Syria's fiscal space and the incentives of its rulers. As before, so many times in the past, Syrians are again forced to negotiate political order under conditions not entirely of their own making. So after the fall of the Assad regime, by way of conclusion, questions about the new Syrian constitution or the type of model it should adopt for its economy, they're not simply questions of institutional design or growth strategy for maximizing GDP. If treated as technical problems, without references to these historical dynamics of uneven development, they risk preserving a very familiar outcome: new political forms resting on the much older and still unresolved tensions of uneven development. I'll leave it there. Thank you.